73 years ago, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to his fourth term as President of the United States. He would die in office 5 months later, but although he was gone and his wife Eleanor was widowed, their legacy continued, as it does today. We've come to New York City not to discuss politics or to offer a history lesson. Instead, we're visiting Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College to see how Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's work continues through students, faculty, research, special exhibitions, and events. I'm BJ Fennell, and this is Take Me Through It.
Take Me Through It is made possible by people like you. Thank you for downloading, listening, and subscribing. And leave us a comment on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.
She gives them the house we're standing in, right? So this is her precise architecture.
It's a Saturday at 47 East 65th Street in Midtown Manhattan.
Sheet of paper, gives it to them at the end of the year, right? So she titles it A Christmas Present to Franklin and Eleanor. Number and street not yet quite decided. She thinks it's going to be around 19 to 20 feet long.
The house has a great history, has been beautifully renovated, but to call it a museum does it somewhat of a disservice. It's much, much more than just a museum.
I'm Deborah Gardner, and I'm the curator and historian of Roosevelt House.
And you get to work here every day?
I work here every day. It's a great privilege.
How much fun is that? How much fun is that?
It's a lot of fun because you meet so many interesting people who are interested in history and also how history is still part of us today. So having that back and forth conversation on a lot of issues just keeps you alert and alive all the time. We have a lot of public programs here where we have interesting speakers about new books. We have documentary films on new topics such as, well, it's not a new topic. We had one on the disability rights movement recently, but we also had a film on the Japanese internment camps. And of course that relates to the history of President Roosevelt very closely. So we have a wide range of activities. We have students here studying public policy and human rights, so we feel that we're training the leaders of tomorrow. And because Roosevelt House has been part of Hunter College since 1942, I feel that it's part of my heritage. My mother was a graduate of Hunter College. I went to Hunter College High School just a few blocks away. So in some ways, it's been part of my whole adult life.
Roosevelt House. Give me the history and how it came to be dedicated to Hunter College, I think you said in 1942.
Okay, so Franklin and Eleanor married in 1905 with President Teddy Roosevelt at their wedding on St. Patrick's Day because he was in New York. And he was Eleanor's closest relative uncle. Her parents were dead. His brother had been her father. And at the following Christmas, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, Franklin's mother, promised them a new home in New York. And
Nice.
Well,
Beautiful house, too.
Yes. So 3 years later, they moved into this house. The whole Upper East Side was going through a new cycle of going from the brownstones of the 1880s and 90s to townhouses, more elegant townhouses at that time. And Sarah had bought 2 brownstones, had them torn down, and then asked the architect to build a new house. And he built a double house. And this was not unusual among wealthy families. They would have these double houses, multi-generational families living there. And so there are 2 complete units behind a facade that looks like it's just one grand townhouse. So everybody had their own dining rooms, their own kitchens, their own bedrooms, and etc. But you could go back and forth in the house at a number of places. And the Roosevelts had 5 children growing up here. So you could imagine with grandma on one side that there was a lot of back and forth. And it also, when the Franklin and Eleanor needed extra space for guests, they would come over and use Sarah's side. So it was a family house, but it also became the center for Franklin and Eleanor's base in New York, civic activities and politics. In early 1942, the president of Hunter came to them. He knew them both and said, we'd like to buy the house for our students, to create kind of a community house for their activities. And the Roosevelts were delighted. They lowered the price. Eleanor, of course, was a big supporter of higher education for women, and Hunter was all women at that point. And they lowered the price, and Franklin actually gave an extra $1,000 to buy books for the students' library.
I think the official name is Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. So let's talk about the institute and the mission statement. I'm just going to read through it. It's basically to educate students in public policy and human rights, support faculty research, and foster creative dialogue. And this, of course, honors, as you just said, Deborah, the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Let's talk about those mission statements and how they are relevant today.
Okay, so our students, our undergraduate students, can choose to have a minor or a certificate in public policy or human rights. So they can major in any field, and then they take these additional courses, which are interdisciplinary, to give them an overview of how you create public policy, what the goal is of public policy in a particular field, whether it's health or food scarcity or transportation. Or in human rights, of course, they get an in-depth education as to the foundational documents in that field, one of which, of course, the foundational document is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in December 1948, and Eleanor Roosevelt was the driving force in getting that document written.
The building of human rights would be one of the foundation stones on which we would build in the world an atmosphere in which peace could grow.
And it's probably one of the most important documents of the 20th century. And of course, if you back up from that moment when she was involved from 1946 to 1948, you know that President Roosevelt was one of the founders of the United Nations. And if you back up even further behind that, you have the four freedoms that he articulated in 1941.
We look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms.
And some of those rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want, were obviously incorporated in the Universal Declaration. And if you back even further, you go back a century to the League of Nations, which Franklin and Eleanor both supported, the outcome of the peace conference at the end of World War I, though the U.S. declined to be part of that. But those notions about rights that were universal for people, many others, really take hold at that moment. And then you can see them carried forward in the lives of the Roosevelts.
So how do you make either the four freedoms or the Declaration of Human Rights relevant to today's students? What are they talking about when in the framework of those four freedoms and also of the Declaration of Human Rights?
Well, one of the ways you make them relevant is as part of their public policy and human rights courses, they have internships. And they have internships in those kinds of organizations. And since we're in New York, of course, you could be working in public policy, you could be working in city government, either an office of the city or in a local elected official's office. In human rights, we have the human rights organizations. Human Rights Watch, for example, is located in the city, so they can actually see the practical application of these lofty ideas on a day-to-day basis. They can do research, they can help in policy with constituents. In human rights, they can do research to see what's going wrong in a particular country and come up with suggestions.
And you feel there has been real impact after, or maybe while your students are here, and certainly after they have left Hunter College.
Yes, many of them do leave with the notion that they want to continue this involvement. For example, in one area in particular, I've heard students talk about becoming lawyers and doing immigration law because the immigration crisis is so great. In fact, what we do with the students is they have time on Wednesdays from 1 to 3 when the college doesn't schedule many classes, so students can go to lectures or panels, and we try to have sessions here on topics that are right of the moment: the Syrian refugee crisis, the Rohingya, for some of our students, the immediate issue about changes in immigration policy for the Dreamers hit home. And so we had sessions on that where we bring in the experts from the ACLU or Human Rights Watch to talk to them and for the students to take this in as part of their studies and then go on in the future in some profession. It doesn't have to be a legal profession. It could be public health, where people who are hungry, after all, freedom from want is about not just not having enough money, though not having enough money might mean you don't have enough food, you don't have enough clothing, you're homeless, and so they're involved in those kinds of activities too.
What about the work that the faculty does here, other than just teaching students? I know there's a lot of research, and the Institute helps them in many ways to get that done, so things are written about. There are public events, there's a lot of research, and there, of course, there is the teaching. So talk to me about the faculty.
Well,
here.
the faculty are, we have what we call Roosevelt House Associates, who are faculty who not only come to our programs, but put together programs. So, for example, we've had a number of programs on climate change because we have people working in that area. And we try to bring together in those programs other researchers, academics, public officials, and students. So our students can participate in the kinds of programs that our faculty put together. We've had programs on presidential history, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Dwight David Eisenhower, where you can look at all aspects of their administrations and see what their legacies were over time. When we had our conference on Lyndon Baines Johnson, we had John Lewis here, and he was speaking in the session on civil rights, and Taylor Branch, who is the great historian of the civil rights movement. It just gave me chills to listen to John Lewis. I mean, he was a participant he was a witness to history, and he's still doing that. He does that all the time to remind people how important it is that it's not just a legacy of civil rights, it's a living aspect of our daily lives, and that's been challenged in recent months. And so we try to bring people in. Our scholars are very good at that. They have those networks of people who can bring that vision to our students.
I want to go back to the Four Freedoms, the famous speech by FDR. I would surmise, just my guess, I'm not a historian, that it might be his second most famous speech after the declaration of war on Pearl Harbor. That, of course, could be argued. It was given in the context of a State of the Union address on January 6, 1941, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the context seemed to be FDR laying the groundwork for the eventual involvement of the United States in World War II, because that war was raging across Europe and in Asia, and China in particular. So how was that context changed? It was mostly about we should be involved, and a lot of people felt we shouldn't. There's a lot of isolationist sentiment in this country. So how does that relate today? The Four Freedoms, of course, of speech, of religion, from want, from fear.
Well, you know, it's interesting because at the time that he spoke about the Four Freedoms, they didn't get, that portion of the speech didn't get a lot of play. And yet we know that he wrote that portion of the speech. He had great speech writers, but he often wrote his own speech, his own words. And I think you're correct in saying it was in the context of what was going on in Europe at that point. He had been moving the country slowly along in terms of understanding what was going on in Europe and what our potential role might be there, so that I would say the isolationist sentiment in January of 41 was somewhat diminished from what it had been the year before, and in 1938, I think it was, when we passed the Neutrality Act. But the context was that these were fundamental, could say, values of what Americans had come to understand, but he was trying to put it in the context that everyone in the world understood. If you listen to his rhetoric, him giving that speech, and we often play that for our guests here, that wonderful repetition that there should be freedom of speech everywhere in the world.
The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world.
Freedom of worship everywhere in the world.
Is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world.
His rhetorical devices were so brilliant but so meaningful at the same time. Today, of course, we haven't solved those problems, not just in this country, but for many people. The number of starving people in the world, the UN issues yearly statistics because of droughts and political situations, the number of people who don't have freedom of speech. We've been seeing the impact on the press in many countries, even the criticism of the press in this country, erosions of that freedom of speech, freedom from fear, that is certainly something that has to be reckoned with in so many countries where we had thought that it had been eradicated. And now, with stronger leaders in place, some of that is coming back. And so those four freedoms are still to be attained in much of the world.
The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear anywhere in the world.
Let's turn our attention to the First Lady, historically, perhaps the most extraordinary in our history. And it was many, many years ago. And she did the good work while her husband was president and then after he had died. I think that's one of the things that made her so extraordinary. She was a force of nature by herself, even though she was tied to her husband, who was president of the United States for a longer period of time than any other president in history.
Well, I think that Eleanor Roosevelt, I would agree with you that she was probably our greatest First Lady and still a model for the future. It was as though she were training for her role as First Lady for many years. She didn't have much of a public life before World War I, although she was then the wife of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But once the war started, she became very active in the Red Cross, and that brought her out of her home. And when they came back to New York in 1921, women had gotten the vote. And there was a whole new world out there for women who were interested in public affairs, as she was. She had traveled to Europe with Franklin at the end of the war and had been at the Versailles Conference, so she had seen all the discussions there. And as soon as she came back to New York and they were out of political office, she was involved in various peace groups. So that was one way she started. She joined the League of Women Voters. She became an official in the women's division of the Democratic Party. Both major parties were courting women voters, not surprisingly. She became a member of the Women's City Club, which looked at problems in the city and tried to come up with policy solutions for them. She learned how to write reports, chair committees. That may be one of the greatest skills that would serve her well later on. And she was out speaking. She was actually speaking on the radio also in the 1920s. Everyone thinks of Franklin as the great radio communicator, and he was. He was absolutely the greatest radio communicator of the 20th century. But Eleanor learned to speak on the radio also. The newspapers were writing about her activities. So by the time that he is elected governor in 1928, she has a full public personality. She becomes First Lady of New York, and as the Depression deepens in 1929 and 30, she is going out and traveling around the state and reporting to Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt about conditions. because having had polio in 1921, he was unable to walk, and so it was easier for her to travel than for him. Then, when he becomes elected president, by the way, she is on the campaign trail as much as he is, in 1932, she becomes First Lady and has much larger scale. And of course, there is much more suffering to be reported on in the beginning of that presidency before the New Deal programs begin to take effect and employ people around the nation. She is also writing for magazines. She is on the radio. And in 1936, she starts her daily newspaper column, My Day, which I call the first blog. And she writes about everything, meetings she goes to, people she's met, books she's read, theater she has seen, and then her travels around the nation to take a look at the New Deal programs and to meet with people and see what was going on in their part of the woods, so to speak. And she was often, so she was seen a lot. And I have to say that both she and Franklin benefited from that new technology of the 30s, which was the talkies. Newsreels would sound. More people saw both of them because they were in newsreels every week at your local movie theater than would have seen them in person. So they benefited from that technology, and of course they benefited from the radio, which you could say was fairly well established by 1932. Franklin had used it as governor, but nonetheless, everybody had a radio. You could have no electricity, you could be poor, you could build a radio, and you could hear the president on the radio or hear Eleanor.
What about the work that she did from the time the president died to the time that she passed away, I believe 1964?
62.
62.
Yeah. Well, I think also we should give kudos to President Truman for having observed her for a number of years, and knew what her qualities were and what her strengths were. Though I think that some of the people in the State Department didn't quite appreciate her abilities. And that, of course, all that work she did in the 20s, pays off in the 40s, late 40s, when she's chairing this committee of the UN, charged with doing something on human rights. And there are 12 different nations on this committee, including the Soviet Union, who wanted to be as obstructive as possible. It's the beginnings of the Cold War. And yet she managed to keep this on track, managed to get compromises from people so that when it was adopted by the UN, no one voted against it. There were some abstaining countries, but no one voted against it, which was truly extraordinary. So it meant chairing these committees from the beginning of 1946 through into December, when it finally, it went through various levels once the committee reports out, but she always kept her hand in on this, and then they finally adopt it. After that, she continues at the UN till 1952, when President Eisenhower doesn't reappoint her.
Politics.
Politics. And she stays in the public view because she is involved with the American Association for the UN. She's traveling internationally. She's writing more books, continues her newspaper column. In 1961, she's appointed to the first Federal Commission on Women by President Kennedy. And when she dies finally in 1962, world leaders come to her funeral, First Lady of the world. And we've seen no other First Lady in history be engaged in that way. But she loved doing things. She loved learning. She was what you would call a lifelong learner. Today, she didn't go to college. She had an excellent kind of late high school, early community college education at a private school, which was very important to her. And then she just kept learning, and she liked teaching people. She'd been a teacher from about 1927 to 33 in a small private girls' school in New York. And so what she did when Franklin became governor was she commuted. She would spend Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in New York City with her teaching, and then she'd take the train to Albany, spend the next few days up there being First Lady. And then on Sunday nights, she'd be back in New York. She was the most peripatetic person.
So how does a woman who died 55 years ago, or how can she serve as a role model to today's young women?
Well, I think, first of all, her total engagement with the important issues of the day would make her a role model for today. She, you can listen to her speeches yet, and certainly we know that even while she was alive, she was inspiring people to go on. Bella Abzug was a student here at Hunter, and she was inspired by Eleanor Roosevelt, who had become a good friend of the college by the early 1940s and met with the students both informally and formally. And so I think her total engagement with the world is what would be the broadest way of suggesting that young women would be inspired by her work.
So what does 2018 hold for the Roosevelt House Institute?
Okay, so what does it hold? It holds a lot more of the same, but we've also in the last 2 years started to do large exhibitions. And right now we have an exhibition called World War I and the Roosevelts, Franklin and Eleanor, Family and Friends, in commemoration of the U.S. joining the war in April 1917. And since the exhibit is going through February, it's also in a way commemorating the end of the war in November of 1918. But in the fall, first in 2018, at the end of May, we're going to open a new exhibit about the Four Freedoms. It is the 75th anniversary of the famous paintings of the Four Freedoms by Norman Rockwell. And earlier you may recall that I said the Four Freedoms didn't seem to get as much play in 1941 when he talked about them. Well, when Norman Rockwell was inspired by them and created these wonderful images, which were subsequently published in the Saturday Evening Post, all of a sudden they were known nationally and maybe internationally. And so it's the 75th anniversary of the paintings. The Norman Rockwell Museum is going to circulate 2 exhibits. One is going to be with the original paintings and ancillary material, and that will open at the New York Historical Society on May 30th, 2018. And within the next day, we will have an exhibit at Roosevelt House. Young artists were commissioned to respond to the Four Freedoms today. So we're going to have that artwork here at the house. And of course, we have original Four Freedoms posters from 1943, so they will all be integrated into the exhibit. So that'll be up in June, July, and August. And then in September, we'll have 2 exhibits here. One is celebrating the 75th anniversary of Roosevelt House as Roosevelt House, and the other will be the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Eleanor Roosevelt's work with that. So we have a lot coming up, and we will have many programs that go with these exhibits as well as our usual calendar of events, 2 or 3 nights a week at the very least.
Well, we'll certainly be back in 2018. Deborah Gardner, thank you.
Thank you.
I encourage you to visit Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. You have to book a house tour in advance. You can also get information on the public programs, events, and exhibits. All the details can be found at the Institute's website, roosevelthouse.hunter.cuny.edu. That's roosevelthouse.hunter.cuny.edu. Thanks for listening and subscribing, and please tell your friends all about us. Emails can be sent to me at bj@takemethroughit.com. That's bj@takemethroughit.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. I'm BJ Fennell. Thanks again for listening. Take Me Through It is a production of Fennell Communications, LLC.